Terrific. And before I share my screen and jump into the conversation, I just want to give everybody the opportunity to introduce yourselves. If you want to unmute and introduce yourself live and in person, please feel free to go ahead and do that. If you'd rather just introduce yourself in the chat and just say, who you are, where you're from, if you want to say what your role is. I suspect many of you are McKinney-Vento liaisons, but you may have some other roles as well. And I'll start. I'm Patricia Julianelle. I'm the Senior Strategist for Program Advancement and Legal Affairs at Schoolhouse Connection. And I'm one of the team that has been bringing you these opportunities to have a little bit of a community of practice and just have some informal discussions together this year, together with my colleagues and friends at New Mexico Appleseed, and of course, Dana Malone at PED. So I'll stop talking. If anybody wants to jump in and introduce yourself live and in person, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, I see them coming in the chat as well.
Good morning, everybody. Stephen Montano for New Mexico Appleseed. I'm looking forward to the next hour. Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen.
Megan Mead, also from New Mexico Appleseed. I'm the Director of Law and Policy here. So also looking forward to learning in this presentation.
Hey, Megan.
I'm Dana Malone. I'm the State Coordinator for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth with PED. I'm glad to see everyone with us today.
I'll pop on real quick. I'm Crystal Gonzalez. I'm with Deming Public Schools, just ready to learn what this one's all about. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal.
Hi, my name is Ingrid Montoya. I am a CHW and EA at Gordon Burnell Charter School in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Hey, Ingrid, welcome. All right, I'm not going to pressure anybody else to speak up, but I appreciate you introducing yourselves. I see everyone who introduced yourselves in the chat, so thank you very much for doing that as well. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. No, actually, the first thing I'm going to do before I share my screen is I want to put into the chat for you the link where you can access the presentation that I'm about to share. So I will do that. I'm doing a poor job at multitasking here with Zoom, so give me 1 second. Okay, I think I shared the wrong screen. Let's try that again. First of all, in the chat, here is a link where you can access the presentation that I'm about to share with you. You're welcome to download it, use it, follow along. You can download it and edit it if you want to reuse it for a presentation of your own. So please feel free to take a look at that. Okay, and now I am sharing the correct screen. Here we go. Great. So our topic today, as hopefully you all know, is the overlap between homelessness and special education. I do have some slides to share, but since this is a conversation and since it is June, I would love for it to be informal and for us to just talk. For those of you who aren't familiar with Schoolhouse Connection, I think most of you are, but we're a national nonprofit organization working to overcome homelessness through education. We have a lot of resources on our website, so please feel free to take a look on our website. One thing that I want to point out specifically is the Q&A from our inbox. I'm going to share some scenarios with you today about special education and homelessness and how they overlap. And those scenarios I actually stole from our Q&A from our inbox. They are actual questions that people sent to us, and we respond, and then we kind of de-identify those questions and put them in a Q&A, an FAQ, I guess, that's on our website. So if you think that you would be helped by seeing what other people have asked questions about and what answers we've given, it covers everything from McKinney-Vento to financial aid, to unaccompanied youth, special education, transportation, early childhood, lots and lots of different topics there. And Karen Rice from Schoolhouse Connection, who's actually on our conversation today, leads the project to get those all uploaded and share them with you. So take a look at that if you think that might be helpful to you. But what I'd like to ask you to do, if you don't mind, just to get us started, what brings you here today? What is a problem, a challenge, a question that has come up for you when you've been working with a student who had an IEP, or maybe you thought might have some special education needs and was also experiencing homelessness? I'd love to hear what brings you here, and that way I can kind of focus our discussion on any questions and challenges that are really burning in your mind for you right now. So if you've got a key word, a key issue, something that's bugging you about students with disabilities who are experiencing homelessness and how we can serve them better, please type that into the chat. I'll give you maybe a minute just to go ahead and do that. And then that will help me focus our conversation today a little bit. You can also see on this slide, that link will actually take you right to the FAQ that I was just talking about, that Q&A from our inboxes. So if you're interested in that, you can navigate there from our website, but you can also just go right there with that link. So here are some of the issues that come up for me. The first thing I wanted to just kind of lay as a groundwork is that a lot of people, I think, get caught up in, oh, well, McKinney-Vento says one thing, IDEA says something else. We've got this conflict. We don't know which law to follow. We don't know what we're supposed to do. And I wanted to just kind of lay the groundwork that IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the federal law that provides different kinds of rights to typically to the parents of students experiencing who have a disability. IDEA actually requires that the school district and the state and the charter school comply with McKinney-Vento for students who are experiencing homelessness. So it might seem sometimes like there are conflicts between IDEA and McKinney-Vento, but IDEA actually requires McKinney-Vento compliance. So you can't be in compliance with IDEA if you're working with a student with a disability who's experiencing homelessness and you're not in compliance with McKinney-Vento. You can't be because that law requires that we have to honor both of the laws and both sets of rights. So I kind of wanted to lay that as just a little bit of a baseline for us to keep in mind. I see that we've got some questions coming in. These are great. LEAs often aren't aware of surrogate parents or that the caregiver can step in. So Dana, it's like you were reading my mind because that's definitely one of the things I wanted to talk about. And someone else who is interested in finding resources for youth getting help with homelessness, youth without children, and prevention. So hopefully that's something that we can talk about. And if people have ideas to share, please go ahead and share them. But here are kind of the topics that came to my mind in my own practice and my own work regarding students with disabilities experiencing homelessness. First one is decision-making for unaccompanied youth, which goes right back to the question that Dana just raised. So I want to talk about that first. Another thing is immediate enrollment and just the timeline. When do evaluations happen? How quickly do they have to happen? When do they start? And how do IEPs work if you've got a student who might be moving around from school to school or district to district? So I want to talk about that. And then the last thing is transportation. We get a lot of questions about that, and particularly, is transportation required? And if so, who pays for it or how is it funded? So we'll talk about those three topics were the ones that just kind of jumped to the front of my mind. And I'm happy to answer other questions on anything else. So feel free to type questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask questions at any time. First thing, decision-making for unaccompanied youth. Here is a scenario. Again, this is a real question that we received from a liaison regarding a homeless unaccompanied youth who is already receiving special education services, so already has an IEP, and is residing with her grandmother. The parent is still involved and does not want the grandmother to make any educational decisions. But the school doesn't think the parent is the best decision maker since she has no communication with the student. I, being the liaison, I want to make sure we're following the student and parental rights as outlined in McKinney-Vento as well as the IDEA. So we've got three individuals here, the youth, the grandmother, and the parent. And then of course we have the school trying to figure out what to do, who makes the decisions, who do we follow? And this is an area where things are a little bit different between the McKinney-Vento Act and IDEA. So they're not conflicting. Again, remember, we've got to follow both of these laws and we will. So I don't want to say that they're conflicting. I just want to say that they handle the situation a little bit differently. So for those of you who have been working with unaccompanied youth for a long time, you know that under the McKinney-Vento Act, a homeless unaccompanied youth, she can make her own decisions. She doesn't need an adult to do that for her. The McKinney-Vento Act gives her her own rights directly to her as the student. So she can decide, I prefer school of origin or I prefer the local school, and she can go through that best interest determination with the school on her own. She doesn't need her grandmother or her mother to do that. She can make decisions about, classes she wants to take. So the McKinney-Vento Act really does give rights like what a parent would have directly to the youth. So that's not really what this liaison is asking here. Here, the liaison is asking about who can make decisions about the special education services. So they're kind of two different categories of decision. There's all the regular decisions that any student would make in the school. And in those cases, the McKinney-Vento Act allows the youth to make those decisions herself. But then there's another set of decisions that are specifically related to special education. Who can sign an IEP? Who can decide, yes, we're in agreement with this particular kind of therapy, or yes, we're in agreement with, pulling the child out for some extra help twice a week, or whatever the services might be. Those categories of decisions that have to do specifically with special education, those are different. So how are they different? Well, for unaccompanied youth, again, just for special education, those rights actually belong to the parent specifically. They don't belong to the youth. This is just the way IDEA is written. It gives rights to the parent, not to the youth. So for example, when I used to be a special education attorney, and I represented, in my mind, I represented students, but actually legally, I didn't represent the students at all. I represented their parents, and I had to do what their parents wanted me to do because they were my client, because under IDEA, it's the parent who has the rights, not the youth. But there's an interesting definition of parent. And you can see on the slide, it has 1, 2, 3 different parts, and all of these different people are considered to be a parent, but this is also kind of an order of priority. So the first person or people who would be included in parent would be what we would consider to be legal parents, whether those are biological parents, adoptive parents, it doesn't matter, they're legal parents. They have the first priority in making these decisions for special education services. After that, an individual, and you can see this is from quotations, I took this directly from the law, an individual acting in the place of a parent, including a grandparent, step-parent, or other relative, with whom the child lives. So that we might call those a McKinney-Vento term. Sometimes we say caregivers, we might have other shortcuts, but we want to make sure that all these pieces are in place, that the student is living with that individual, and that individual is acting in the place of a parent. And you can see this lists at relatives, basically, is who it's considering. So if you don't have number 1 and you don't have number 2, then you go to number 3. And this is what Dana was talking about in her question, surrogate parents. Because these rights don't belong to youth, if we don't have a legal parent, we have to basically kind of make up like a fictional parent, and they're called surrogate parents. And it's just a person who is appointed just to make special education decisions for this particular student. It doesn't give them any parental rights. It doesn't mean that the student's going to live with them or that they're going to take care of the student. It just means that they're only going to make these special education decisions for the student. Surrogate parents are typically appointed, like I said, by the school or the school district. Sometimes the state also helps to get involved in training surrogate parents and providing surrogate parents. But this is a process that happens internally at the district. So it's not like a youth walks in and says, hey, I want this person to be my surrogate parent. They're going to make my decisions for me now. Unfortunately, it's not that easy because, again, remember, the youth doesn't have any rights under IDEA particularly. So they need to have this surrogate parent appointed through the school district or a school process. Now, the youth certainly can say, I really would like this person to be my surrogate parent. They know me, I know them, they have my best interests in mind. And the school could go ahead and make that person the surrogate parent. And that would probably be a great thing to do, because then you're working with someone who has a good relationship with the student, who knows the student, and hopefully can be part of a team to make sure that the best interests of the student are upheld. So that can happen, but it happens through a school process. So those are kind of the 3 categories of parents, again, in order of priority. And then you see I've got a weird thing at the bottom that says temporary surrogate parent. What does that mean? Well, sometimes it can take a while for a surrogate parent to be appointed by the school district. It should happen quickly. It should happen within 30 days or less. Now, 30 days can be a lot for a student who's experiencing homelessness with a disability, though, because they might be moving around. They might not be in that school anymore after 30 days. So then they get to a new school, they start all over with a new surrogate parent, and then maybe they move again. And they never actually get to the point of having a surrogate parent, having evaluations done, getting the IEP, and getting services in place. So for our highly mobile students, time is really important. And so that's why for unaccompanied homeless youth, there's this figure called a temporary surrogate parent. This is someone who can be appointed immediately. The school district can just say, liaison, you're going to be the temporary surrogate parent, or shelter caseworker, you're the temporary surrogate, or that person that the youth said, hey, this is my caregiver, I want this person, perfect, immediately, same day, you're the temporary surrogate, let's get started. Let's get an IEP signed, let's get some evaluations started, whatever the process needs to be. You can have a decision maker in place immediately for an unaccompanied homeless youth specifically. And then while that temporary surrogate is getting the ball rolling and getting things started, then the school can go through the typical process of getting, a permanent surrogate appointed. It might be the same person, it might be a different person. And it might take 30 days, and that's fine. But you've got this temporary surrogate in place who's really just kind of getting the ball rolling and helping to get some immediate processes and services in place for the youth. So you can imagine that this can get a little bit complicated. You may have 2 or sometimes maybe even 3 of these people involved at the same time, all trying to make decisions. You may have none of these people and you're trying to help a youth get services and there's nobody to sign a piece of paper to get the services done. So this can get complicated. At the link on the bottom of this slide, there's a document that I prepared many years ago with the National Association of State Directors of Special Education that just kind of breaks this down into its parts and its steps. So that might be something that might be helpful. You might want to share that with your special education team because they might not even be aware, particularly of the temporary surrogate, since that is just specific for unaccompanied homeless youth. They might not even know that that exists. It is in the regulations, it is in the law, but IDEA is a huge law with hundreds of pages of regulations and things get missed. So it may just be the case that they actually are not aware of it. So if you take a look at this slide, let's take a look back at our scenario. We've got our student. She's living with her grandmother. The parent says she doesn't want the grandmother to make any educational decisions, but the school doesn't think the parent is the best decision maker. So how are we going to do this? Well, we've just got to go back to our definition of parent, and we have somebody in role number 1 here. We have a legal mom who is saying, I want to make decisions. I want to be in charge. I don't want this number 2 person. Grandmother meets the definition of parent under number 2, right? So if the mom were not involved, if she were just, missing or incarcerated or just not available, or, you try to reach her, you can't reach her, grandmother actually could be considered a parent under number 2 here. And she could make all the decisions and you wouldn't have any problems. You would just work with her, have her sign the IEP, etc. But in this case, you've got a number 1 here who's trying to be involved. And so the school does have to work with that decision maker, even if maybe they don't like the decisions that she makes, they don't agree with the decisions that she makes. She is the decision maker in this case. Now, there certainly could be an opportunity to have a conversation with the mother, to say, hey, we really think that this is in the child's best interest. Here's why. We'd really like to talk to you about it. Let's have a meeting. You certainly can try to convince a parent of what you think is best for the student. I mean, the special education team presumably are the experts in the disability that the child has and what would be the best services for her. So you can have those conversations, but the parent does have legal rights. And if the school goes around her and tries to do something different than what she wants, the parent actually could, potentially have some kind of legal action under IDEA for this. So you do want to be careful about the rights of parents. Even if, the parent wasn't around and grandmother was there and she was ready to work with you and she's, said, yes, I want to sign the IEP, I want to be involved in this, you still do need to go through some motions of trying to contact the parent. Call her at the last phone number you have, send her a letter at the last address you have. You want to show that you have some record of trying to contact her before you just go ahead with what grandma wants or before you appoint a surrogate parent, because these are rights that do belong to the parent, and that's pretty important. I see in the chat that someone is asking, what about having the grandparent fill out a caregiver affidavit? That can be really helpful for things like medical care. It might be helpful just to have a paper trail for your McKinney-Vento process. But for IDEA, a caregiver affidavit is not going to make a difference. For IDEA, you've got to follow this order here. If the mother wants to be involved, she's number 1. And having a caregiver affidavit is not going to change that. So, again, that might be something that is really helpful for you paperwork-wise for McKinney-Vento. And that's super fine to do that. But not for IDEA. So this gets pretty strict. And I emphasize it because, like I said, the parent could have a legal action to take against the school district and say, I said I didn't want my child to get these services. The grandmother did want her to get the services. You gave her the services. You went against my wishes. The parent could have a potential legal action there. So let's see something just kind of a slight riff off of the same scenario. Again, this is a real issue. An unaccompanied youth who is not in agreement with his parents about his IEP. He is currently living in a youth shelter until he turns 18. So I'm presuming that he's 17 now, maybe not, but he's not 18, we know that. He's working really hard to advocate for himself, and his parents are creating many barriers to his education. Can my student have another adult identified as the guardian and signer of the IEP? Do his parents maintain the right to sign the IEP? So again, this is very similar to the case we just saw, except there's no grandmother involved here. So this youth really, in the context of the IEP and in the context of special education, he is kind of stuck with what his parents want. Now, once he turns 18, those rights could transfer to him and he could be in charge of his own IEP. He could say, you know, yes, I do want the services, or no, I don't, whatever the case may be. And he can advocate for himself in that way. But until he turns 18 and his parents are trying to be involved and trying to be active in his education, then they're going to be the people who are going to have to sign the IEP, and the student cannot identify somebody else and the school cannot identify somebody else. Now, again, it's kind of weird. And every decision that's not about his IEP or not about special education, if it's about, you know, he wants to be on the swim team and his parents say no, or he, you know, wants to take a credit recovery program and his parents say no, or he wants to transfer schools, all of those decisions that are not special ed, yes, the student can advocate for himself. He can make those own decisions. He can work with a caregiver that he wants to, that he identifies and says, you know, this is my mentor. I want my mentor at the table for this conversation. All of that is true. So I don't want to confuse anyone. We're really talking about just these special education decisions. So here's a great question, Crystal, and I was going to say this is really important. What if he requests, I feel like I'm talking like Elmer Fudd today, requests another adult advocate? Could there be someone at the table that he wants at the table in addition to his parents? So again, we're not going to try to exclude the parents. We're not going to try to go around them. They have the ultimate decision-making authority. But what if he wants somebody else there with him? And this has happened to me, again, like I said, I used to do special education law. And at the same time, I was also worked in the court system with youth who are involved in the juvenile delinquency system, as well as those in the child welfare system. And for a lot of youth, I was their attorney. I was directly representing the youth in a child welfare case. So in that case, I don't work for the parents. I don't work for the court. I work for the youth. And if the youth, my client, says, I want you at my IEP meeting, then I would go. I absolutely would go to the IEP meeting because that's what my client has asked me to do. I understand what the limitations that my client has in terms of his rights at that meeting, but I'm going to be there and I'm going to represent his opinion and what he wants. And I'm going to try to see what I can do, you know, to get him, his parents and the school to, you know, to try to work together to get him what he wants in regards to his special education. At the end of the day, the parents are going to be the ones making the decisions. They're going to be the ones who have the ability to you know, bring some kind of legal action. But I would say, you know, if you have a student like this one who's really working to advocate for himself and his parents are putting up barriers to his education, and he says, you know, can I have my mentor or my attorney or this person, my caseworker from the shelter, come to the meeting? And, you know, the school can make a determination that this is an important person to be part of this IEP team and have them at the meeting. And, you know, the parents might not be real happy with that. So there might be a conversation that needs to happen with the parents to say, here's why we made this decision. We want to have an inclusive IEP team. We want to have all the opinions at the table so that we all can make the best decision for this child's best interest. And so that's why we invited this person to come. So Crystal, thank you for bringing it up. That's really important. And it's a great way to try to give the youth a little bit more of a voice in a situation where they don't legally have a lot of voice. All right, any more questions about unaccompanied youth and their decisions? I'd be really interested, has anybody on the call today, have you worked with any of these difficult situations? Have you worked with an unaccompanied youth and you weren't sure who could make decisions, or you had a parent who wanted to make decisions and also the youth? Any kind of conflicts that you've been involved in and how have you resolved them? If anybody wants to share.
You know, Patricia, I think I'll just speak up again to that situation. I just, you know, feel like as a parent of a child with special needs myself, I totally understand how that can affect, you know, the children, and keeping their best interest in mind and in heart is so critical, and making sure that these IEP teams work together to facilitate for that child. We've always got to remember who we're serving and why. So I think just getting those, just a sidebar comment, I've not really run into that situation here in Deming myself just yet, but because I strive to really make sure that that rapport building is done, and that parents know that teams aren't against them, they're for them and with them in that. So I think just really making sure that parents understand that and having those really in-depth conversations to make sure that we are staying focused on what's best for the child, and usually can kind of mitigate those issues.
I appreciate that comment so much, because I know, you know, in my role as an attorney, of course, I was advocating for my client, but I also was kind of on the outside a little bit looking in. And I definitely felt many times how emotional these situations can be. And you know, you may have parents who are blaming themselves. They feel guilty for something that has nothing to do with them, but they may feel guilty, or they think I'm not doing enough for my child, or, you know, I should do more. And then you might have a school who feels like they're being blamed, or they're also in the same situation thinking, oh gosh, we could do more, we should do more. So I think emotions can run really, really high in these situations. And I totally agree with you that just really orienting everybody to why we're all here, and that we all want to just do what's best for the student. And it's not about, you know, you're a bad parent, or you're a bad teacher, or you're a bad student. It's just about how can we all work together and support the family and the student and the classroom. And yeah, the emotions can be really challenging, and just coming into the meeting with that kind of openness and just transparency, I think is so important.
I have a question. This is Linnell with Rio Rancho Public Schools. I'm also working with Dana Malone with the state of New Mexico in a contracted perspective, I guess you could say. But I had a question in regards to discipline, in regards to students with IEPs, and say the discipline has come to a point where we need to make a best interest determination for the student be withdrawn from the school, saying that they need to be relocated to their home district. What would you say in regards to that?
Thanks, Linnell. So yeah, that can get really, really complicated. For students with special needs, there are some very specific limitations around the discipline that can be imposed. So if you're working with a student who is both McKinney-Vento and has a disability and has an IEP, or is in that process of getting evaluated, you really want to be careful, again, to make sure that you're looking at both of the laws, both sets of legal rights, and applying those both. So the first thing I would say is, work with your special education team around, where are we in the process of discipline for this student? Where are we in the process of putting behavioral interventions and supports in place? What is the infraction, that the student supposedly committed? Because there's different kinds of discipline that would be allowed. Let's say if it's a violent offense, or having a weapon or something like that. Then if it's some other kinds of behavior. So I think the first thing to do, even before talking about, well, maybe it's a best interest thing under McKinney-Vento, maybe he needs to change schools, would be to make sure that the team is looking at what are his rights under the IDEA in regards to discipline, and make sure that we're complying with all of those, because there are limits on the number of days you can have a student disciplined, and the kinds of discipline that can be imposed. And if a student's going to be out of school, the kinds of services that have to be put in place. So I would say, let's make sure we're doing all that correctly. On the McKinney-Vento side, having the student change schools because of discipline, I think is a really, you want to have a very, very careful, best interest focused conversation about that, because it can't ever be, and please don't take this personally, I'm not accusing you of this at all. I just want to make sure I'm expressing the law correctly. It can't ever be like, this student is difficult, we're having a hard time with them, let's just send them over to another school, let's just get rid of them. The best interest determination is what it says. It has to be about what is best for this student. So I think having that conversation in the context of a discipline issue is really difficult, because it already feels a little bit tainted to me. Like, well, we're already talking about moving him because of discipline. That already feels punitive. And best interest isn't a punitive decision. It's about what's best for the student. So I think that's why I think, starting with the special education lens, working with the IEP team, what's in place, what supports can we put in place, what's needed, what's missing, how is the disability impacting the student's behavior, having that conversation and really working through that process way before getting to the point of, well, let's just have a best interest determination and just move him. There certainly are situations where, because of attendance issues, other issues, yeah, it may absolutely be in the best interest for that student to move to the local school. That happens, that comes up. But I would say let's go through the special ed and intervention process first before we turn it into a best interest kind of situation. And I'd be happy to hear other input. If people have other thoughts or input on that, I'd be happy to hear it. All right, that was a good, I gave my little teacher pause there. Let's move forward to the next issue I wanted to talk about, which is immediate enrollment. And again, I think we all know that under McKinney-Vento, our students experiencing homelessness get enrolled immediately. And enrollment means attending classes and participating fully in school activities. It doesn't matter if they don't have documents. It doesn't matter if they don't have school records. It doesn't matter if they don't have their IEP. They are enrolled immediately and participating and attending immediately under McKinney-Vento. And that, again, that is true under IDEA as well, because IDEA says you've got to comply with McKinney-Vento. So we've got to have immediate enrollment for students. Sometimes I get questions where someone says, well, we sort of did immediate enrollment, but we have them on the books, but we're not actually going to put them in any classes until we get a copy of their IEP. No, that's a violation of McKinney-Vento, and it's also a violation of IDEA. So even if a student has an IEP or is in the process of getting one, or you don't know, I mean, someone shows up to enroll, you probably don't know if they have an IEP or not at that moment. Sometimes a parent will know, but sometimes they won't, understand the lingo, or they won't know what to say or how to explain it. And so you just don't even know, but we're always going to provide immediate enrollment for our McKinney-Vento students, period, full stop. The IDEA does have some information about well, okay, so what if the student does have an IEP? So you find out later that they do have an IEP. How does this work? So let's say you get a McKinney-Vento student who comes in, you enroll them immediately. You find out a week later when you get their school records that they have an IEP and they were actually supposed to be getting some different services than what you've given them. So you haven't been giving them the right services, but you didn't know. So you get a copy of that IEP. Now what do? It's from a different school district. It's not your IEP. It might even be from a different state. So what do? Well, if the IEP is current, you provide appropriate services immediately. And appropriate means services comparable to those described in the previous IEP. So why does it say comparable? I mean, really what you want to do is you want to provide what the IEP says, because that's really, bottom line, you're supposed to do what the IEP says you're supposed to do. It says services comparable because there may be some services that you just don't have the infrastructure at hand to provide. And the classic example that my friend Pat Pop, who has a PhD in special ed, she always gives me the classic example of a student who's supposed to be doing OT in the school pool, and your school doesn't have a pool. So you're not going to be able to do occupational therapy in the pool because you don't have one. You don't have to build a pool. You don't have to necessarily find a pool in the community to use. You can provide occupational therapy comparable to something that would be done in the water. So something different, or different physical therapy, or, maybe, like I said, things that you can't exactly do what the IEP says, but you can do something comparable to it. So you want to do your best, basically, to implement the IEP as written and maybe make some adjustments as necessary in consultation with the parents. So, and again, and this is immediate, you see, it says must immediately provide appropriate services. So you get that IEP, you say, whoa, they were supposed to be getting group therapy once a week. I didn't know that. I didn't have the IEP. We got to get that done. We got to get him in that therapy, ASAP, right away, same day. If you already have group therapy happening on a Tuesday, you find out on a Monday, okay, yeah, we'll get him in Tuesday's group therapy. But you want to do this immediately. You have to get school records promptly. This is, pretty basic. It's kind of a silly thing to have a law about, but the law actually does say that you want to get school records promptly, and the previous school must promptly provide them. So I know a lot of times I hear from liaisons, we've asked for the school records and we've asked, and the previous school won't release them. Well, under IDEA, they have to release them. And the same thing with McKinney-Vento, they also have to release them. So for whatever that's worth, to be able to call and say, I know you don't want to release them, or you're having problems, or the student has a library fee and you're not releasing the records, but under both IDEA and McKinney-Vento, you have to release those to us. Now, once you have that IEP in your school or in your district, you're doing your best, you're immediately providing appropriate services. Now you can have your own IEP meeting, and you can either just sign off on the current IEP and just say, okay, we're just going to go ahead and adopt this fully for our district just as is, And of course, the parent's going to be involved in that decision. Or you can make some adjustments to the IEP. Maybe again, you say, we're not going to do OT in the pool. We're going to do a different kind of OT because we don't have a pool. So you make those adjustments as part of the IEP process. And again, parents are going to be a part of that, just like they would for any special education process or decision. So I guess if you don't remember anything about this, because it's a little bit detailed, a little bit complicated, if you don't remember anything, just remember immediate enrollment applies for special ed students too. So just like for your McKinney-Vento students, there's no exception to immediate enrollment for a student who has an IEP or who is in the process of being evaluated. They still have to be enrolled immediately, basically. So let's do a quick scenario on this one. And again, this is a real question that we got. We're getting resistance to doing special education evaluations for McKinney-Vento students who have changed schools frequently or who have missed a lot of school. What are the rules about evaluating such students? And I've gotten this question a lot over the years because IDEA wants schools to try to distinguish between, let's say, maybe poor academic outcomes that might be because a student is not attending school. So, they're doing poorly academically because they're just missing a lot of days. Or they might have some other challenges at home that are not related to a disability, but they are impacting their academic achievement. Homelessness is a perfect example of this. It's something that's going on in their lives that absolutely could impact their academic achievement, but probably, just the act of being homeless has nothing to do with the disability. So schools are asked to kind of tease out what is a disability and what is maybe a circumstance or something happening in the environment or something related to not having instruction. Lack of instruction is kind of the term that the law uses. And those of you who are special education experts know far better than I do, there are ways to do that. There are different kinds of testing and assessments, and psychologists have ways that they figure out, yeah, this is because the students missed 40 days of school, or no, the student has a learning disability, or whatever the situation might be. And those kind of determinations are made through the evaluation process. You can't tell, is it because of the homelessness, or is it because of the attendance problems, or is it because of a disability? The way you figure that out, ideally, the student would be able to attend school every day and not be homeless anymore, and then you'd know. But in the absence of that, you figure that out by doing an assessment, by doing the testing, by having the psychologist meet with the student, by going through that process. So you don't want to use, and legally you cannot use, things like changing schools a lot, things like missing a lot of school, things like being homeless. You can't use those as a reason not to evaluate a student. Those are considerations that are part of the evaluation process. They are not a reason to postpone or delay or deny the evaluation process from happening. So the Department of Education on the Office of Special Education Programs, not the McKinney-Vento side, but the actual special education side, they've issued some guidance around this that's really clear and that's very specific and says, if you are getting that resistance and saying, he's changed schools twice this year, he's missed a lot of days, we're not going to do the assessment until we get him consistently attending for a month. No, you can't do that. That actually would be a violation of IDEA, and the parent could, again, pursue legal action because of that. And you can imagine also for a student experiencing homelessness, if that happens over and over and over again. I worked with a student once who had autism, and he finally, when he was in the first grade, for the first time, he was finally getting an evaluation. And he had been in preschool, he had been district preschool, he had been in kindergarten, he had started the first grade. And every year they had said, oh, we better evaluate the student because he has autism. But every year he moved, he changed schools, he missed school. And so they just never got to it and never got to it and never got to it. So 3 years later, he's finally getting services that he should have been getting for 3 years. So that's why we have to just kind of jump in and do the process regardless. But now what happens if this child moves in the middle of the process? So your district says, okay, great, we're going to, we know that we're just going to jump in and start the evaluation process right away. We're not going to wait. Let's go. Let's get it done for the student. He might move. And then he does move. So maybe you've done 2 evaluations, but there's 3 more that you haven't done. You're right in the middle of it and student moves, goes to a new school. What happens at the new school? Do we start over again on the first day? Let's start the whole process over again. No, we don't start over. The new school picks up the process wherever it stops and just continues. They can take the evaluations that the previous school district did and just use those and continue doing whatever additional evaluations are needed. And the clock keeps ticking. So there are time limits that a district has to do this evaluation process. I actually don't know how long it is in New Mexico because it can be different state to state, but it might be something like 60 days. That clock starts when the evaluation process begins. If the student changes schools in the middle, the clock does not start over again. It keeps on ticking. So you might get a student coming into your school on day 45 of their evaluation process, and guess what? You got 15 days. Now, you can extend that time frame if you meet both A and B here. If you're making sufficient progress, if your district can show, whoa, we're doing our best, we've got these evaluations set up, we've got our psychologists coming in, but 15 days, we're pushed here. We don't really typically do this in 2 weeks. So, but we're doing our best, we're making sufficient progress to ensure prompt completion. And the parent agrees to go ahead and extend the time frame. So the parent and the LEA must agree to a specific time frame. So it's not just we're making progress and it's going to take as long as it takes. No, it's we're making progress, and based on what we're looking at the calendar and the availability of our psychologists, we think we can get this done in 25 days. And the parent says, okay, then that's okay. So again, just to let you know, if you don't take anything away from this, just remember, we have to do evaluations when they are requested, and we have to keep them going even if that student is moving from school to school. You get a student who's in the middle of a process, you've got to pick it up in the middle and run with that. So here's just a kind of another example of the scenario. Again, a real question we got. A McKinney-Vento student with an IEP placed in a public or private program that is not physically in their school of origin. This happens a lot for students who have some special needs that the school cannot meet on site. And they might place that student in a different school. It might be a different public school. It might be a private school because they don't have the services available to actually provide that student what the student needs. So the school district, I had a lot of students, a lot of clients who went to private school, and they were placed there by the school district because the district just didn't have the infrastructure to serve them into a private school. And then that McKinney-Vento student maybe moves now to a different school. What happens to them? What's their school of origin? Who pays? This can get very, very complicated. The one thing I want you to keep in mind is when a school district or a charter school, if you place a student in a different school through an IEP process, the IEP team makes a decision that, this student is going to go to, Santiago private school for students with learning disabilities, let's say, and it has nothing to do with your school, but you are the ones placing him there because that's the best place for that student. Now that private school is that student's school of origin because it's a private school, but it's actually kind of a public school because the public school is the one who sent him there. So that student now has the right to stay at that private school, even if they change school districts, just the way any school of origin situation would work under McKinney-Vento, that private school is going to be a school of origin, just like any school of origin would be. Now that private school at some point might not be in their best interest anymore. The IEP team might say, oh, he actually doesn't need that anymore. He did so well. We're going to pull him back into the public school system now. We want students in the least restrictive environment. We don't want them to go, away to special schools if they can be served in the public school. So that, that might change based on the student's needs, and that's great. But just remember, school of origin is going to apply to any school that a public school student is attending, even if that's a private school or a different public school. So I see we have a question here. What is the number of days for the evaluation to be completed by in New Mexico? And I will look that up for you and send it to you. I should have looked that up before the session, and I apologize for not doing that. 60 days is typical, but it can be different state to state. So let me look it up and let you know for sure what that timeline is. And I will definitely send that out and let you know. Thank you, Janet, for that question. Yeah, Dana Malone, I was saying you also feel like it's 60, so we're feeling that, but I'm going to get the actual citation for you and send that to you. So I think the only last thing I wanted to talk about was transportation. So just before I get into that, any other questions about, immediate enrollment for students with IEPs or timeliness of evaluations for students? Anything about that so far before we do everyone's favorite topic, transportation? All right, let's do it. So remember, again, if you want to comply with IDEA, you have to comply with McKinney-Vento also. So if you have a student who's experiencing homelessness and has a disability, they get all of their IDEA rights and they get all of their McKinney-Vento rights. So that means they do have the right to remain in the school of origin. Like I said, even if that's a private school, they have those full rights to the school of origin, which includes transportation to and from the school of origin. So this is completely in force for students with disabilities who are experiencing homelessness, just like if they did not have a disability. They get all of those school of origin rights. You want to make sure it's in their best interest to stay in their school of origin. Certainly, a disability could be part of the best interest conversation. You know, a student might have, let's say, a physical disability where being on a bus for more than 20 minutes might be actually physically dangerous for that student because of a certain respiratory disability or something else the student might have. And so at that point, you might say, wow, we'd love to keep them in the school of origin, but that's actually physically dangerous because of the student's disability, and you might need to make that transfer to a local school. So disability can be part of the conversation, but the student absolutely has those rights to stay in their school of origin if it's in the student's best interest, and to get their transportation. In terms of payment, there's no strict federal guidance about who pays for transportation to the school of origin for a McKinney-Vento student who has a disability, except what's on this slide. So remember, the McKinney-Vento Act says that in terms of transportation to the school of origin, if it's two different LEAs, the two LEAs can do whatever they want. One can pay for all of it, one can pay for none of it, one can do the morning, one can do the afternoon. However, if they cannot agree, they must split it 50-50. That's what McKinney-Vento says. What IDEA says is that IDEA and IDEA funds are responsible for whatever's on the IEP. Those are services that are due to the student's disability. The student needs those services to be able to benefit from a public education because of a disability. And so typically speaking, the special education account picks up the tab for those services. So you want to look and see if transportation is listed as a service on a student's IEP. When I represented parents in special education hearings, I always asked for transportation as a related service on the IEP. Always, always, always. In those days, I'm aging myself now. In those days, McKinney-Vento did not provide transportation to the school of origin. In those days, if it wasn't on the IEP, then now I've got a parent who's trying to transport their child to and from school. And, you know, my clients were all typically involved in the child welfare system, or I represented them pro bono. So these were folks who often didn't have a car, had weird work hours, couldn't, reliably necessarily transport their children to school. So I always advocated pretty hard to get transportation listed as a related service on the IEP. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And it really is a decision of the IEP team. The parent can advocate for sure, but it's going to be looking at, how does this child's disability interact with transportation? So if the transportation is on the IEP as a related service, then absolutely the special education funds and system should pick up that transportation costs to the school of origin. If it's not a related service on the IEP, then you really can't use special education funds to pay for that. And so then you'd be treating that student like any other McKinney-Vento student, whether that's your McKinney-Vento grant pays, maybe Title I pays, maybe general funds, whatever the source of that transportation funding would be. You've got ARP-HCY now, many of you, so you could use that. So if it's not on the IEP, you're going to look at whatever sources of funding you use for your other McKinney-Vento students. And I see a question in the chat: how does transportation work for a charter school that does not offer transportation? That's a great question. And we have some resources on our website specifically for charter schools. So I definitely would encourage you to, if you go to our website, we have a little search box on the bottom left of the page. It has like a little magnifying glass in it. If you just type charter school in there, you're going to get a lot of information that we developed together with the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools. So take a look at that. But short answer, it applies the same. Transportation to the school of origin is required regardless of what a school or a school district provides or doesn't provide to any other student. So if a charter school does not offer transportation, but you have a McKinney-Vento student who's attending the school of origin, maybe your charter school is the school of origin, the student has moved farther away, but they're staying with you because they like your school and they like the program, it's working well for them, then that transportation to the school of origin would be required. Typically, I think the charter school would collaborate with wherever the public school district. Pardon me, I lost my headphone. The charter school would collaborate with the public school district where the student is residing. So collaborate meaning, maybe that district has buses available. Maybe they already have some kind of an account set up where they can provide gas vouchers to the family, and then the charter school would just pay the bill. Again, any agreement that the charter school and the school district want to make is fine under McKinney-Vento. If you cannot agree, then you split it 50-50. So basically it's the same for charter schools as for school districts, no difference. There are school districts that don't provide transportation to anyone, and they also have to provide for McKinney-Vento students. And I see in the chat, Dana Malone to the rescue. Yes, confirmed that the evaluation must be complete in 60 days. Thanks, Dana. All right. Any more questions about anything that we've talked about or anything that we have not talked about related to special education and students experiencing homelessness? I did not at all touch on early childhood services. So preschool special education for your 4-year-olds who may have a disability. Of course, the district is required to provide, even if you don't provide preschool for anybody, you're required to provide preschool for children with disabilities. That's something to consider and to think about as a liaison. If you're working with a family who has a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old who may have a disability, to go ahead and start that referral process to have an evaluation done. Because if they do have a disability, then they can get into preschool special education programs. And there's also a program for children birth to 3 called early intervention, and that's for children who have a developmental delay or are at risk of having a developmental delay. And those services are very family focused, which is great because those services will go out to wherever a family is staying. They'll go to a motel, they'll go to a doubled up situation or a shelter and provide, at that point, it's really a lot of services to the parent to help the parent understand ways to interact positively with their child in light of that developmental delay that the child might have. So early intervention for children 0 to 3, preschool special education for your 3.5-ish up to age 5. I just want to make sure that you all are aware that those programs exist and are there for children who might have developmental delays or disabilities. So let me go ahead and stop my share. Look at people's faces. Any other questions, anything that you want to raise, anything that I didn't talk about that you want me to look up and send you some follow-up information on? Because I will send you this PowerPoint and also the recording, a link to the recording so you can share it. And if you want to give me some homework to do, I'm happy to do that. So if there's any other questions that we haven't answered, I can look that up and get back to you. So any other final questions, concerns, or anything you need that we might be able to help you with?
I just wanted to say I really appreciated that slide on the descending order of who has say in the IEPs. That shook it out really great for me. That clarified a lot of stuff for me too.
Good.
So,
I'm glad. Great. Yeah, and that on that slide, that link that I have to that longer document, it's not that long, even it's like 4 pages, I think, but that also kind of really breaks it down and makes it clear. So I'm glad that was helpful. All right, then, everyone, I will let you go. I'm very grateful for your time. I hope you all have a wonderful summer. I hope you get some time to relax and recuperate this summer because I know how hard you all are working and how difficult the last 2 years have been. And so I wish you a good break and a peaceful break, and we will see each other again soon. Thank you so much.